Thank you for joining me this evening for part 6 of the Bible and the Trinity in Conflict. Tonight we're going to be taking a close look at Hebrews chapter 1, verses 7, 8, and 9. Previously, we've looked closely at verses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. First verses 1, 2, and 3, 2 and 3, and then 4, 5, and 6. And I'm grouping them together in the best way I think is going to allow us to get into the substance of the text so that we can understand what it's saying and then be able to communicate it to others. Even though this show is a part of the series about the Bible and the Trinity and conflict, as most of you who watch my videos know, I'm not really trying at all to create conflict with Trinitarians or anybody for that matter. But I can't help if we already have a conflict or if there's a conflict that I can't resolve, but that continues to affect people who, like me, have certain views about the same texts that others have strong views over. And so at times, while we can set aside these conflicts and still exist together without becoming too difficult or unable to work socially or otherwise for the betterment of each other and others. Unfortunately, at times, that's just not possible because we each feel strongly about these texts. By each, I mean Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians, and specifically people like me who not only do not believe in the Trinity, but who believe that the Bible teaches sons of God theology. That is, that the sons of God, whom the God of the Bible gave life to, are gods. They're called gods by God and by the one who's called God's firstborn. The one we talked about in our prior show when we discussed Hebrews 4, 5, and 6. The one we're going to be talking about tonight as we discuss Hebrews 7, 8, and 9. And if you've been with me for the prior videos involving Hebrews 1 to this point, then you know that the author of Hebrews initially started his letter by stating that in prior times, in the past, God spoke to them or to their ancestors by means of prophets, human prophets. But that in these last days, being the last days of the first century, the time when Hebrews was written most likely, in those days, during that time, the author of Hebrews writes that God spoke to them by means of a Son, the one whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the ages. It then describes him as the outshining of the glory of God's being, or the outshining of God's glory and the copy of his being, the imprint of his essence. Doesn't use the term ousia that we'll talk about more when we get into the Trinitarian councils and more deeply into some of the Trinitarian writers of the 4th and following centuries. But it does use the word, as I've explained in my prior videos in this series, that means essence or being. And so the author of Hebrews makes it clear that while in the past God spoke through prophets, even if by means of angels, it was to prophets, ultimately. People like Moses, David, not just prophets, right? They were more than that, but they were also that. Because God spoke to them, made promises, foretold events. And many others, Isaiah, Jeremiah. So Paul, the author of Hebrews, some believe is Paul, refers to them and says, okay, but in contrast to that, now he's speaking to us by means of a Son. The firstborn, the one who became better than the angels after he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in high places. It says that specifically in Hebrews 1, 4, 5 through 6, and that ultimately, when he brings his firstborn into the world, all the angels or sons of God would bow before him. Please see the prior video for more of the context and meaning and significance of those events. But there are a couple of other texts. I'm just going to refer to these briefly, and then we're going to get right into our reading, because I mentioned that in Hebrews 1, 1 through 6, it spoke of how the Son became better than the angels, not by his nature. It specifically says he became better. This is leading up to our reading, so I want to make sure we have this all in mind. It's very important you understand the sequence of the writer of Hebrews' mind and what he's talking about. Why is he quoting these texts? Well, previously we've shown that he's talking about the contrast between human prophets and the Son, and the significance of that. And how that one gave his life, even though he was the Son through whom God made the ages, imprint of his being. He gave his life and was raised to the right hand of heaven, of glory of the majesty in heaven, God's hand. And he became better to the angels to the extent, just like Paul says in Philippians 2, that he was given a name better than theirs. And in Philippians 2 it talks more about that as well. And then in Revelation it talks about the new name being the Logos. Whether or not that's the same name or not, again, if you watch my prior videos, I talk about it. But in leading up to this point, which is verses 7, 8, 9, the significance of what the author of Hebrews has in mind, Paul is talking about just previously how the Son has become better than the angels after being resurrected to heaven at God's right hand. In Hebrews 8:1, it says, in fact, I'll bring it up here and we'll read it together. There's just two texts that I want to show. Oh, actually it looks like three. So let me do that, and I'll make it larger for us unless you want to go yourself to Hebrews chapter 8. But these are relevant because they fit with Hebrews 1, 4, and it's speaking of Jesus becoming better than the angels after being resurrected to God's right hand. So, two other texts in Hebrews, the same letter, that speak of something very similar are these right here. I'll make it a little bit bigger. These weren't ones I planned on reading together with you. I was going to read them out loud, but we'll go ahead and share them. So there's three. I copied them over briefly. This is what I was doing just previously before we started the show. A couple things I thought about. So it says in Hebrews 8:1, now as to the things being discussed, this is the main point. We have such a high priest as this, and he has sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Verse 2, a public servant of the holy place and of the true tent, which Jehovah put up. We're not going to get into the divine name. I don't agree with its usage here, but I'm just using the NWT for the references to him being at the right hand of the throne of majesty. Him being the high priest, which we know the context in this, if you've read it, is Jesus. A public servant of the holy place and of the true tent. We'll just say which God put up and not man. And then jumping down to chapter 12, just one more verse, we'll go back to our reading. As we look intently at the chief agent and perfecter of our faith, Jesus. The same writer who wrote, they sat down at the right hand of majesty in Hebrews 1, wrote what we just read in Hebrews 8, 1 and 2, and now Hebrews 12, verse 2. For the joy that was set before him, he endured a torture stake, despising shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So very specifically here, it's referring to God, here, throne of majesty in high places. We bring up NWT, and it's actually, that specific part about sitting down at the right hand of God is the end of verse 3. after he made a purification. We talked about this in my first video in this series on Hebrews 1, and then we also did further as well in the second part. After he made a purification for our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in lofty places, just like we read in Hebrews 8, and similar to 12, where it specifically refers to the throne of God, the throne of the majesty and then the throne of God. So that's what it's referring to. Same God of whom he is an imprint and who spoke long ago through the prophets, but today, in these days, in the first century, by means of Son. He became better than the angels because he inherited a name more excellent than theirs. Right? And then it goes on to describe things that were only true of the Son when he became a human being. And then it goes on to speak of things that will be true of him when he is brought into the inhabited earth, just like in Philippians 2, and given the name, just like it specifies here. And just like in Philippians 2, when all knees in heaven and on earth and below the earth bow down before Jesus to the glory of God the Father, that's what they do here in verse 6. Right? But the angels never became a human being in the way that the text here in Hebrews 1:5 speaks of the Son having done, fulfilling the messianic text that we reviewed in my last video in this series, quoted in verse 5, that is the reason he became better than the angels. Right? He sat down at the right hand of majesty after he did this. So he became better. He became better right here because of this. And this is what led to this. Is that not also what Philippians 2, 5 through 11 states? He was existing in the form of a God, and then he took on the form of a man, was faithful all the way into death in the form of a slave, as a man. And then he was raised and given the name above every name. It's almost the same thing that we're reading here in the verses leading up to our subject texts. So let's get into it. Hebrews 1, 7, 8, and 9. I'll be reading from the NWT, but I will be discussing other translations and reasons why. So follow along with me, and let's take a look. Carrying on what we just talked about, right? The reason I went through that and brought us back up to speed from where we left off is because we have to keep in mind what he's talking about. Why is he quoting these texts? It's because he's showing the Son has become better than the angels. He already pointed out that he's better than the prophets, just by referencing the two, right? Prophets obviously are not as valuable as the Son. The one who is the exact imprint of his very being, outshine of his glory like we talked about, raised to his right hand. So that's obvious. And then he goes on to talk about the angels and how he's better than them. He's not talking about him in terms of their nature. He's talking about them, or him in terms of him being better than them, in terms of the name he inherited. So it's not even just that it's the name or the position he's given, like in Philippians 2, but that he's given this name, just like in Philippians 2, as an inheritance. Well, who gave him that name? Who's making him better than the angels, right? That's not his human nature that's better than the angels. That doesn't make any sense. And it's not only inconsistent with the teaching of the text, it shows that Jesus is not a man in his heavenly state at the right hand of God, which we can see also from this text right here, Hebrews 1:3, and the descriptions given, but also Galatians 1 and many other texts as we've talked about. Well, so what if it's not his? If we're talking about the reflection of God's glory and the imprint of his being, and him being at the right hand of God as such, he's better than the angels, not because of the descriptions that were just given, but because of the name he is given. Paul, the writer of Hebrews, could have easily made the argument if he wanted to, and if it was true, that he was better than the angels because he's better than the angels by nature. He doesn't do it. In fact, given the opportunity, he chooses not to do it because it's not true, right? He's a spirit too, just like the angels, just like God, John 4:24, Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15:45, life-giving spirit. All of the descriptions given in Revelation 2 and elsewhere are him as a spirit. Paul makes it plain he's not human. Paul had a vision of him in heaven. Okay, so then he goes on to describe in the first verse of our reading, verse 7, also, in this same line of thought, right? He's better than the angels because he received a name after he was raised to heaven by the Father, and therefore, when he's brought into the world by the Father, all of the angels will bow before him, just like Philippians 2 says, and which is consistent with the way that Jehovah allows his Son to be honored as him, knowing that it's to his glory. Something that is nowhere even hinted at or consistent with what is described in Isaiah about the one to whom all knees bend, right? That's consistent with it being to the glory of the Father in Philippians 2, and that's why here it's the Father, God, of whom Jesus is a copy, that brings his firstborn into the inhabited earth and says, let this happen. Just like Jesus in Revelation 3:9, like I talked about in my last video on this subject, says, I'm going to have all the followers of the synagogue of Satan come and worship before his followers' feet. He's letting that happen. So he's showing these are ways the Son is better, right? He's been raised to heaven, right hand of God, and all are going to bow to him to the glory of God. And so he goes on to say in verse 7, with reference to the angels, he makes his angels spirits and his public servants a flame of fire. Now we read earlier when I read Hebrews 8 how the priest in heaven, Jesus, is also a public servant. Same thing, same reference, same term used, but with regard to the temple, right? The holy place, versus the way that the servants in the Hebrew scriptures were used by Jah as flames of fire, representing him, speaking as him, but not serving in a high priestly capacity in the new Jerusalem or the temple in heaven that's described later in Hebrews and in Hebrews chapter 8. When it refers to his public service. So what is this public service that these angels or flames of fire were made to do? Let me move this over a little bit too, so it's fully in view. Well, that kind of changed it though, didn't it? Whenever I adjust the text, it will change it. Well, we're going to go to different texts anyway, but just to get us closer to Hebrews, there we go. All right, so now let's take a look at what it could be. So he's quoting a text, obviously, right, in Hebrews 1:7. They're quoting references to angels as flames of fire. And the quotation is from Psalm 104:4. So let's take a look at a couple instances of angels as flames of fire that were written before Psalm 104:4. Here in Exodus, you have Jehovah's angel, Exodus 3:2 through 6 specifically. Jehovah's angel appears in a flame of fire. We reviewed this in our recent text readings. To Moses in a thorn bush. And it goes on in the account to describe that God called out to him. But it also specifically describes, it even says, I'm the God of your father. This is how the angel talks, right? It says the angel of Jehovah appeared in a flame of fire. This is what Hebrews 1:7 is talking about. This is a flame of fire Jehovah has made as a public service to him. The angel appearing in the thorn bush, is it not? Well, this is one of the accounts that were written prior to Psalm 104:4, where angels are represented as flames of fire performing a service as servants to Jehovah. And in Acts chapter 7, it specifically identifies both angels and the angels. It singles one out and then refers to a plural as the ones who were speaking in these accounts. So even though it says God called out, or that the one speaking is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the true God or the God, it's the angel talking, not Jehovah. He's talking through the angel. Right? The angel's being used just like Hebrews 1:7 says, in a flame of fire, serving Jehovah. So the angel of Jehovah, whom many Trinitarians believe was actually Jehovah, right? They say he talks like Jehovah. So even though they'll argue with you that Hebrews 1 says Jesus is not an angel, because angels are not God, they're creatures. They're on a lower level, even though they're described as having the same spirit. I'm not denying they're creatures, but that's not, see, they misrepresent the Bible's teaching about being a creature and claim that it makes you unfit to be in some way similar to God, even though it specifically describes them as spirit beings, even though one's a creature and one is God. But the other ones that are creatures are gods. And so they're made by the Creator, even though they're of the same nature, and hence they're his direct sons. Just like the firstborn one, the Spirit as well. Okay, so what are a couple other accounts of angels as flames of fire? Exodus 13 says Jehovah went ahead of them in a pillar and a flame of fire. But then in Exodus 14 it says the angel of God was going ahead of the camp of Israel in the pillar. And then it would talk about how Jehovah began to look out upon the camp of the Egyptians from within the pillar of fire. So it speaks of the angels. What I'm getting at is specifically as Jehovah or as God, even though the account makes plain, it's the angel. It goes on to describe in Deuteronomy 4:24, God is a consuming fire. Moses refers back to God speaking out of the middle of the fire, but we know who it was, right? The angel of God. But again, it doesn't differentiate. Why? Because the angel isn't representing itself, or it's not. It is only acting as Jehovah. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how the angel talked. You can read the account fully yourself and see the same thing repeated over and over. I'm just kind of going through a brief review of these things so you understand clearly what Hebrews 1:7 is talking about. Well, who are these angels? Well, it's clearly inclusive of the angel of Jehovah, whom Trinitarians will say is the uncreated angel or something equivalent to Jehovah because of the way it talks or the association with Jehovah, even though that's what our whole point is about Jesus and Jehovah, that as his messenger or angel, even though he's obviously different from the angels as the archangel, right? It's how his voice is described by Paul, 1 Thessalonians. Well, if you have the voice of something, that's what you are, right? He has the commanding call. It doesn't mean he's a trumpet, right? That's an inanimate object. A voice is a characteristic of an actual person, right? The type of voice you have. And the call is raising the dead. So all these things point to him as a unique archangel. He's not, and so there's maybe some question about whether that means chief angel and hence an angel as well, which Jesus clearly is in the sense of being one sent by God, right? That's what an angel is. Messianic text of Isaiah 9, which we'll get to in a moment, in the translation of the Septuagint, specifically calls him an angel of great counsel, in translating the term for God. My point is, it's not a problem for angels to act in this way, as we've talked about in the past, but this is what Hebrews 1:7 is talking about. Goes on in Deuteronomy to refer to God as a consuming fire. Refers to the 10 words which Jehovah had spoken to you in the mountain out of the middle of the fire. Acts 7 specifically says that was angels who transmitted the law. And then in Judges 13, we read the account where there was a man of the true God that came, and his appearance was like an angel of God. Very fear-inspiring. And then, this is Judges 13, it goes on, Manoah and his wife, this is who it's talking about. It goes on in verse 13, Manoah said to Jehovah's angel, let us detain you, we'll fix up a kid, we'll offer sacrifice. Jehovah's angel says, no, but if you'll render up an offering to Jehovah, you can do it. I'll stick around. You honor Jehovah, right? It's the whole point. Glory to whom? God the Father. That's never changed, and it never will. Manoah did not know it was Jehovah's angel. Verse 17, Manoah said to Jehovah's angel, what's your name? Jehovah's angel said, why do you want to know my name? It's a wonderful one. He avoided the question. We talked about that before. But then verse 20, as the flame ascended off the altar heavenward, Jehovah's angel ascended in the flame of the altar, while Manoah and his wife were looking on, and at once they fell upon their faces to the earth, bowed all the way down, as Jehovah's angel is ascending in the flame. That is the sacrifice to Jehovah. Verse 21, and Jehovah's angel did not repeat appearing to Manoah or his wife. Then it was Manoah knew he had been Jehovah's angel. Consequently, Manoah said to his wife, we shall positively die, because it is God, or I believe it should be translated, a God, that we have seen. So Manoah clearly received public service here from Jehovah's angel as a flame of fire. Did he not? Did he not also recognize him as a God or God? He did. So there's precedent for most of the things that we read about Jesus in the ways that are appropriate for him as the one raised to the right hand of God, when this is how the ones in our reading of verse 7 described as angels, spirits made public servants, flames of fire, are contrasted with him in similar terms that we'll get to potentially, but because of where he is after being resurrected to the right hand of God. So in these texts involving angels as flames of fire that Jehovah made as public servants, these were all done apart from any elevation to a position that is above everyone. This is all without any of that. But when you get to Hebrews 1, it's all about what Jesus did as the Son, coming to earth, giving his life, being raised to the right hand of God, and becoming, through that process, described in very similar terms by Paul in Philippians 2, he becomes better than the angels by inheriting a name better than theirs, because they weren't the ones who went through what he went through and were resurrected as God's Son, called in the messianic sense of verse 5, God's Son, and I today have become your Father, like in the original application, which we talked to in our prior video. None of them were given this position at the right hand of God, so that when he brings them into the inhabited earth in the future, right, when the Son of Man arrives in his throne, what's he going to do? He's going to separate the sheep and the goats. Matthew 25. Well, here he's at the right hand of God. But when he brings his firstborn into the inhabited earth, when he becomes enthroned, when the Son of Man sits down on his throne, all the nations will be gathered before him. Because he's given the position and name. He's better than the angels. He's been given a new name that is above every name, to the glory of Jehovah. And so he then compares in verse 7, the angels in the prior days, right? That's why I say you've got to follow the sequence. He goes from this, well, I grouped it this way, so we could see the way he's grouping these texts together, right? He's moving on from here, the time when the firstborn's brought into the inhabited earth, when he takes his throne, and all knees bow before him. Then he goes on, first verse of our reading, and says he makes the angel spirits and his public servants a flame of fire. We just read several texts from Exodus to Judges of those angels as public servants, flames of fire. Verse 8, but with reference to the Son, God is your throne forever and ever. And the scepter of your kingdom is the scepter of uprightness. Now in other translations, like the King James, it says, but unto the Son he saith, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom, or your kingdom is what thy means. Or the New International Version, but about the Son he says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever, and righteousness will be the scepter of your kingdom. So there's a difference there, isn't there? Is the Son addressed as God here, O, thy throne, O God? Or is the author of Hebrews quoting the text to argue that God is the Son's throne? And if so, what does that mean? And the scepter of your kingdom is the scepter of uprightness. We'll get to that part further in a moment. But let's talk first about this part, God is your throne forever and ever. It comes from the Psalms. He's quoting from Psalm 44 in the Septuagint, or Psalm 45 in the Hebrew. Let's take a look. We'll come back to that. Psalm 45 in the Hebrew. Okay. So he's talking about the king. You can clearly see from verse 2 forward. That is why God has blessed you to time indefinite. He says, I'm saying my works are concerning a king. May my tongue be the stylist of a skilled copyist. You are indeed more handsome than the sons of men. Charm has been poured out upon your lips. That's why God has blessed you to time indefinite. Gird your sword upon your thigh, O mighty one, with your dignity and your splendor, and in your splendor go on to success. Ride the cause of truth and humility and righteousness, and your right hand will instruct you in fear-inspiring things. Almost to our quoted text in Hebrews 1:8. We already looked at Hebrews 1:7, and then the background to it, right? The angels as spirits in public service to Jehovah. Now, what is this throne? Is the Son called God? And what about this scepter? Your arrows are sharp under your peoples, keep falling in the heart of the enemies of the king. God is your throne to time indefinite, even forever. Scepter of your kingship is a scepter of uprightness. Verse 7, you loved righteousness and you hate wickedness. That is why God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of exaltation more than your partners. Okay, so the application here is clearly to a human king that is obviously representing Jah on the throne. So, as I mentioned in the pre-show discussion, it's sometimes easier when we talk about these texts and whether or not to translate it as thy throne, O God, taking God, theos, ha-theos really is what's in the text, most early text, the best text. That's what they call a vocative, a direct address. Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. Or is it talking about God being the throne of the one who's better than the angels, having been given a position in heaven at the right hand of God on his throne? Well, what about the translation aspect? So, people will often say that the most practical way, I've heard it read in Murray J. Harris and others, sometimes it's that the best translation is with a vocative. I don't see that at all. I don't see either Psalm 45:6 in the Hebrew or the Greek Septuagint or the quotation in Hebrews 1:8 as more likely being vocative. In the Greek text of Hebrews, the quotation says, ha thronasu, ha theos. So it uses clearly the nominative form. And sometimes the nominative can be used as a vocative. But it can also just be used as a nominative. And so if we take a look at the text in Hebrews, if you look at some of the surrounding context, it talks about, for example, in 46:1, God is for us a refuge and strength. So if I pull up Psalm 46:1, and we look at that, in the Greek it says hatheos hemon kataphige kai dunamis. It doesn't use the verb esteem, is what I'm getting at. It follows the Hebrew text and often does where the verb is understood. So it's very similar to Psalm 45:6 or 44:6 in this case in terms of the Greek. Right? There's no expressed verb if we look at the Greek. So the Greek of Psalm 45:1, 46:1 in the Hebrew, the Greek is hatheos hemon kataphige kai dunamis, the God of us, refuge and strength. So again, it's similar if you look at Psalm, and let's do that now, we'll compare it with that fresh in our mind, Psalm 45:6. If you look at the Greek, Psalm 44, let's see, Psalm 44:7. So hathronasu, hatheos, there's no verb. The throne of you, the God. The God of us, Psalm 45:1 Septuagint, the God of us, refuge and strength. To me, they look very similar in terms of the use of the nominative without an express verb. That's what I saw when I read the context and the surrounding usages of theos, and I got the start of the next chapter, and I realized, it's very similar, and I just didn't get the sense at all that hatheos is used as a vocative. I see it as either the subject, the same way that the NWT translates it, God is your throne. The nominative as the subject, and with your throne as the predicate, and we'll get to what that means in a minute. And it's possible you could translate it as the predicate with the throne as the subject. Your throne is God. But it would mean essentially the same thing. I just don't think that comes out quite right, or the emphasis is correct. Because the source of the royal authority under discussion is God. Right? And it goes on to even say that explicitly in verse 7 of the Hebrew of Psalm 45, and the Greek of Psalm 44, and the Hebrew, verse 9, chapter 1. We'll get to it in just a second. Okay, so I just want to point out in the grammatical part of things, there's no reason at all. There's no real reason why we should feel compelled to see hatheos in either the Septuagint of Psalm 44:6 or Hebrews 1:8 as a vocative. It doesn't appear that way, obviously, to me at all. It appears more like the use of hatheos in Psalm 45 Septuagint, Psalm 45:1, Psalm 46:1 Hebrew. Our God, strength and power in Septuagint. That's how I see it. Okay, now there's another part to this, because let's just finish off the grammatical aspect, because when we're talking about Hebrews 1, if we, let me just see here, so and notice here, notice here, God is your throne and the scepter of your kingship. And if you go to Hebrews 1, let's do that now. I'll go back to our subject text, at least verse 8. We'll get to 9 in just a second. We're moving right through here, trying to provide context as we go through it, because it's very important you understand the build-up and the sense of each, statement or quotation that's presented about the Son and what it means. So now, here you see the same thing, verse 8 in the NWT. God is your throne, and others would take it as a vocative. Thy throne, O God, right? I read them already. The King James and NIV are just examples. Most translations, really. Although I don't think that's correct. It certainly doesn't appear obvious I've already discussed why in part. And then it goes on to say, just like the Septuagint, scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of brightness. Now there's a variant in this part of the text. Your kingdom. The earliest and I would say best text, P46, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus, say his kingdom. You hear in Hebrews 1:8. It changes the quotation, you could say. And I believe the writer of Hebrews does so intentionally, like I point out in my second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defended, when I talk about Hebrews 1:8, in response partially to Murray J. Harris. I talk about how it shows the writer of Hebrews is taking hatheos as a nominative, right? Because there's no real reason to change your kingdom, the Septuagint translation of Hebrews 45, Psalm 45, 6. There's no reason not to use that pronoun if you saw hatheos as evocative. If you're already saying, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever, scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. But yet, let me point this out, the significance of the variant verses, that is the variant between your kingdom and his kingdom, in the second part of verse 8. It's from Metzger, second edition of his textual commentary on the New Testament. Starting on page 592, although the reading out to of him or his kingdom, which has early and good support, P46, Sinaiticus B, may seem to be preferable, and I believe it is, because it differs from the reading of the Old Testament passage that is being quoted, like I just mentioned, and because the earliest and best texts use it, right? And it is changed from the quotation, which I believe is significant because it more likely shows hatheos is viewed as a nominative by the writer of Hebrews. He goes on, to which on this point, presumably the mass of New Testament witnesses have been assimilated. I'm talking about the change from autu, from su to autu, him versus you. A majority of the committee was more impressed than the early support for autu. A, by the weight and verity of the external evidence supporting su or you, and B, by the internal difficulty of construing autu. But there's really not a difficulty if you just accept the text, right? Either way, you could argue there's some difficulty if you saw the initial part, as I mentioned, as evocative. You're kind of in a conflict there because you're breaking away not only from the sense of the text in terms of the direct address, but that's not even the quotation. So it's pretty significant. But they were more impressed by, as I mentioned, the external evidence supporting tu and the internal difficulty of construing out tu. Thus, if one reads out tu, the words hatheos must be taken not as vocative, O God, an interpretation preferred by most exegetes, Trinitarians, most of them, but as the subject or predicate, as I mentioned, an interpretation that is generally regarded as highly improbable. I don't see it as improbable at all. In fact, I see it as just the opposite because, again, there's no reason to see it as vocative in light of, for example, Psalm 45:1 Septuagint. It's the same basic use of hatheos, it seems to me. There's nothing that calls out for it to be evocative, O God. And then you have the writer of Hebrews changing su to autu, when su would be much easier to sustain a reference and understanding of hatheos as vocative. And that's why he says if one reads autu, the words hatheos must be taken. I don't know that that's necessarily correct, but I don't believe it's true at all, as I mentioned, that we have to take hatheos as vocative even if both readings are su, right? Your throne, your kingdom. That doesn't require hatheos as vocative. God is your throne, your kingdom, right? The scepter of your kingdom. God is your throne and the scepter of your kingdom, right? I could be talking to someone and say, hey, God is the source of your authority, right? God is your throne and the scepter of your kingdom. That's evocative. right? But it not in the first sense, right? Because you're not using theos as evocative, but you're still describing the person, is what I'm saying. You're still speaking about them, but you're not speaking about God as the object of direct address by saying God is your throne. You're still describing the king, right? Still talking about the king. So again, it seems to me that the change from the original reading, it's not something nefarious. It was done, I believe, by the author of Hebrews to show clearly he's not used. It made more sense for the writer of Hebrews to use it in that way, in the way he's applying these texts. So, and he also uses a couple other terms like "and" that aren't specifically, but that's again a part of the way he's using these texts. So I think that's significant. He goes on just to complete this point here. Even if one assumes that Kai, which is absent from the Hebrew and the Septuagint of the Psalm, as I mentioned, was inserted by the author with the set purpose of making two quotations, with verse 8a in the second person and 8b in the third person, the strangeness of the shift in persons is only slightly reduced. So again, it's a question of how strange you see the change from your throne, O God, or God is your throne, to his kingdom. It does seem strange, right? God is your throne forever and ever, and the scepter of his kingdom. It could make sense that way. But if, O God, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of his kingdom, right? That would require a separation between the one you're directly addressing. Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of his kingdom. You see what I'm saying? There's no way you can connect out what is said in regards to out to his kingdom with the direct address, if that's how you see hatheos in the first part. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of his kingdom. See what I'm saying? That doesn't fit. And it's a change from the original text, at least according to the text we have of the Septuagint of Psalm 44 being quoted in verse 8. So I definitely see the earliest texts of P46, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus, and the reading of out 2 as a clear indication that hatheos in the first part of verse 8 is not evocative. And I don't believe it's evocative even if we accept the reading Su, preferred by Metzger and the UBS committee, in spite of the textual evidence of P46 and the other texts I mentioned. Because it's very similar, as I also discussed, the way hatheos is used in the nominative sense in Psalm 45:1. So why are we even thinking of evocative? Really, to me, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit, and it's certainly not the best, the preferable, like they say it is. Certainly, that's the impression you get when you just look at the English translations. But I don't see why they should be considered the weight of evidence, right? They're just opinions by people who haven't discussed it the way we are. Or if they have, we've already reviewed and talked about most of what they've had to say. And so there's no compelling reason that they have given that says this has to be, oh God. And that's what I would say to people if you wanted to just kind of make it quick and easy in terms of a discussion, right? Not get into the whole vocative and nominative. That's not easy to do. And you could also even point out that there are uses of God in the vocative. Thei, theta, epsilon, epsilon. But that's mostly in Ezekiel. I think there's one reference in the Book of Kings in the Septuagint. So you could argue, if I was going to look at it completely, that the Septuagint translator of Psalms just didn't use thei, or the vocative, explicit vocative form of theos. And it is possible that theos is used, hatheos, as a vocative. It's just does not seem to me, upon reviewing the evidence, including reading the texts, the quotations of the text in Hebrews 1:8, and the way that they're written in light of the way that other texts in the surrounding contexts are written, that that's the preferred translation, evocative. But that is not inconsistent with Sons of God theology. We've already discussed in this series of videos and in other videos and in writings I've done and in debates I've done, that the sons of God are gods. It's the very argument Jesus himself makes. In John 10, when his religious opponents accuse him of blaspheming for claiming to be a god. And he argues that their own texts called those whom God condemns gods. So if they can be gods, he uses a text that calls them gods in the plural, how much more so can he be a god? Because he's the Son of God whom God sent. Right? And that God whom God sent, who was with God in the beginning, that we'll get to in one of our future videos, John 1, all the texts. That God in Isaiah 9:6, which we've talked about in my CW Jah Talk series, is called Mighty God. Let's go to that text. So if I were going to view Hebrews 1:8 as evocative, and then we'll come back to Hebrews 1 and look at a few other texts and wrap this up. If I was going to look at Hebrews 1:8 as evocative in light of the Bible, right? Well, we have a basis for doing that. And one of the bases for that is Isaiah 9:6. It's not just a text that calls him God or mighty God, like you would be doing if you called him God in Hebrews 1:8 as evocative, O God, which I don't believe is the likely translation, but that's acceptable in our view as long as you understand the biblical descriptions and the way they describe Jesus and others as gods, the way he argues, like I mentioned in John 10, that the sons of God are gods. They either represent the true God or they do not. And here it speaks about the Messiah and him as a mighty God and more. Isaiah 9:5-6. Well, we'll read 6 and 7. There's been a child born to us, a son given to us, and the princely rule will come to be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called, right? We've talked about this text again in my CW Jah Talk series, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I did there. So I encourage you to watch it. And it goes on to call him Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father. The Septuagint calls him Angel of Great Counsel. So Septuagint text used for centuries by the early Christians. This text isn't quoted in the New Testament text, so that's why I refer to it in that way. But then it goes on to say, to the abundance of his princely rule, right? It says the child's born and the princely rule will come to be on his shoulder. His name will be called. To the abundance of the princely rule and the peace there will be no end. Upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, in order to firmly establish and to sustain it by means of justice, by means of righteousness, from now on into time indefinite. The very zeal of Jehovah of armies will do this. He's the one, the glory to the Father. That's why. It's all because of Jehovah. Even if there's a son born who eventually becomes called God or a God. Just like the angel who ascended in the flame in Judges 13 that Manoah said was a God or God. But what he saw, what he described, was God or a God, in the same way that it's acceptable to call the sons of God who represent God, God. Just like we read in the accounts involving Exodus and Deuteronomy, and the one I mentioned just now in Judges, where the angel of Jehovah and angels, like in Acts 7, say, are the ones who speak as God, if they're doing what he says. Public service, right? Hebrews 1:7, quoting Psalm 104:4. The angel of Jehovah is a part of that, right? Whom we believe, even Trinitarians, to be the pre-existent Son of God. But nevertheless, that's because of the role and position they were in then. None of them were raised to life as king. Not Michael, none of them. Even if Michael could be differentiated as the archangel, right? He's still involved with public service, doing things like in Daniel. And he's not raised to the position of king or even the right hand. That happens after Jesus gives his life. Just like here, it says the child's born and comes to be called, all related to the princely rule, right? To the kingdom, the kingship that would not end. What does Hebrews 1:8 say about the kingship and the throne? We do it right here. It says, God is your throne, or thy throne, O God, forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom, or his kingdom, the reading out 2 in the earliest best text, is the scepter of uprightness. This is all related and applied from the messianic text of Psalm 44:45, Greek, Hebrew, that specifically applies it to the Davidic king, just like here, about the throne, that they would be given forever. Okay, so is it God is your throne, or thy throne, O God? Well, as I said, I believe the weight of evidence is that the God, hatheos, is a nominative, and either a subject or predicate in this text, with it being a subject, God is your throne, meaning God is the source of the authority being given here, as it describes, right? Him receiving the name above every name in Philippians 2, and then here, the name better than the angels, right hand of the majesty in lofty places. God is your throne forever and ever, quoting from Psalm 44:45 about the Davidic kingship that would not end. Right? So, okay, even though I believe it's more likely God is your throne, what does that mean? We'll get back to the whole implication of the vocative, but as I explained, even the Messiah who is given this kingship is called Mighty God. So it would be okay to call him thy throne, O God, right? He's already called Mighty God. The angel in Judges 13 is called God. They speak as God, as Jehovah. So it doesn't make any difference. You're always addressing God through these beings. The Son, more than any of them. That's why he starts out by pointing out that the Son is the main one. Firstborn, exact image, expression of his glory, the one through whom he made the ages. This is the one who would be doing that, and who did, right, all the way to death as a man. Same thing Paul talks about in Philippians 2, right here, Hebrews 1. That's how he became better. He comes back into the earth as the firstborn, with reference to the angels in the past who were made spirits, like we read in the accounts from Exodus to Judges. Here they're quoting Psalm 104:4, where it refers back to those types of accounts with the angels in that way, in a public service, not in the temple of heaven that the high priest Jesus is later raised to, Hebrews 8. But, and 12, like we read earlier, but before that arrangement took effect, when they were serving God without being raised to his right hand as the one on his throne. So it wouldn't make any difference whether he was addressed as God here. They're already addressed as God when they're not even on the throne. So, and in prophecy in Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, he's called Mighty God. Not mighty person of God. We believe he's a mighty God. We believe he's a God who was with the God. John 1:1. We're going to get to it more soon. But we're going to finish up with Hebrews 1 and a little bit of 2. And so here, let's find out a little bit more about what is this throne. If God is his throne, and it's not thy throne, O God, okay. Well, this is what it's talking about. We already read in Isaiah 9, right, how he's the mighty God who fulfills the Davidic prophecy about the kingship that would never end, that would come to be upon his shoulders due to the zeal of Jehovah. So then it goes on to describe in Revelation that when all these things take place, we talked about a few texts that speak of things that take place, like the Son of Man arriving on his throne, when that occurs, and the significance of it. But here, in terms of the throne and the significance of it in Hebrews 1:8, and why it would make sense to say God is your throne, understanding that to be essentially, God is the one who is the source of your throne. Because of texts like this that further explain it. If we didn't have anything that made sense, it still would fit, because it makes sense in the historical context in which it's applied to the Davidic king in Psalm 44:45. So if we take it as a nominative, God is your throne, and we have texts like this in Revelation 3, where Jesus says to the one that conquers, I will grant to sit down with me on my throne. Even as I conquered, just like I did, I'm going to do to you. because I conquered and I sat down with my Father on his throne. That's what we're talking about. This is what I would mean in a more explicit and descriptive sense with the way that the texts are applied to Jesus, and in light, of course, of everything that is said historically in that context, to the Davidic king, to what is said about the Messiah in prophecy in Isaiah 9:6. And then here, when that one directly is said to have spoken about what that means. It means he's being given the same authority as Jehovah. But it's being given to him, just like Hebrews 1, the name that he is given, inherited a name, Philippians 2, right? He's given a position above all others to the glory of God the Father. It's the same thing. It's always from the Father. The Father is his throne. God is your throne. Just like in Psalm 44:45, God was the one responsible for the throne of the Davidic king. But even if we take it as a vocative, might mean hatheos, using Hebrews 1:8, it's still completely consistent with the way Jesus is presented as God, and or as a God or a mighty God. All the descriptions would be applicable to him in the sense that he represents him, the God, the one whom the very next part of our subject text describes as his God. Right? Not something that we want to read here. It's everywhere. John 20, right? Revelation 3, other texts, the opening of letters in the New Testament. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So here in verse 9, the last text in our subject reading for this video, you loved righteousness. It's going on to quote the rest of the application made in Psalm 44:45, Greek Hebrew text. You loved righteousness and you hated lawlessness. That is why God, your God, not you are God, but why your God, the God of you, we'll talk about it more in a moment, anointed you with oil of exaltation more, than your partners. Right here, it explicitly states that Jesus has a God. Even if you take verse 8 in the vocative from the application in Psalm 44:45, same thing, but in the greater sense in which it applies to Jesus at the right hand of God, the whole context leading up to this. It's in the context of him having a God. It's very similar to John 20, is it not? Right? In John 20:28, Thomas addresses Jesus as my Lord and my God in the same sense that angels, like we read about earlier, are addressed as Jehovah, or called God, the voice of God, called out of the bush. It's God we've seen that directly addresses Jehovah. He speaks to them as I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all these things. So in the same way, the resurrected Jesus, establishing who he is to Thomas, is called that. But in verse 17, just previously, he had explicitly stated he was ascending to his God and their God. And so the only God he could be is that God. The Father, my Father and your Father. John 20:17. Right here. Hebrews 1:9, same thing. So if we take a look at the Greek text, God, the God of you. It clearly here does not appear to be vocative in any sense. That is why God, your God, the God of you, anointed you for the reasons just stated that he's been building up after describing him having made a purification since verse 3. And after stating prior to that he speaks to us by means of a son. We discussed it earlier, leading up to our reading. So here in Hebrews 1:9, now in the Hebrew text, it is also explicit. It makes it plain. It says Elohim Elohek. and which has the construct form, the second person, singular form of Elohim. God, God of you. It is undeniable that the one being talked about here, all the way through, in whatever condition you say, this is applied to him. In the very same application, from the very same texts, Psalm 44, 45, Greek or Hebrew, it says there's someone who is this being's God. The being whom they say, in a vocative sense, is addressed as a God or as God. That would also then be true, of course, of the Davidic king in Psalm 44, 45. Has a God. Which we also already know is true, right? We know that the angels as gods have a God. This isn't really something new. It's just kind of new in relation to this text because the way they use it, right? When they're using it, thy throne, O God, he's called God, so you can't even, it's hard to just get through to verse 9, right? And say, look, I appreciate your time, but he's said to have a God over him right here from the original source material and in the application. So we believe it's not only more correct to translate the actual words used, hatheos, as a nominative, based on the way that it's used in the Septuagint and the surrounding context of Psalm 44, which is where Psalm 45 in the Hebrew corresponds with. But the variant reading, for your kingdom, which is his kingdom in the earliest and best text, P46, Sinaiticus Vaticanus, shows that the author of Hebrews was clearly taking hatheos here as a nominative, subject or predicate. But even if you take it as a vocative, thy throne, your throne, O God, it not only applies to the Davidic king in Psalm 44, 45, and therefore must be qualified in the same way that other applications of God are qualified, whether it's figures like Moses, the Davidic king in Psalm 45, 44, 45, the Messiah, Psalm 9, the sons of God, numerous texts, Genesis 6, Job 1, 2, numerous texts in the Psalms, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 97, John 10, Psalm 82. This is not new, as I mentioned. Any of these kings, whether it's Psalm 44, 45, or any of the angels who are referred to as God, are only and ever called that because of the one who puts them in the position where they're called that. Right? Even the Son, is that not obvious right here? He has become better. How? The extent he inherited a name. He sat down at the right hand of majesty, became better, got a new name. Philippians 2, same thing. To the glory of whom? Father, the one who brings his firstborn into the earth, who makes his angel spirits flames of fire like in the past, but with the Son, he enthrones him forever. The Son sits on the Father's throne according to the Son, Revelation 3, we just read it, and then lets those approved sit with him, not on his throne, but on his Father's throne. So that's a third person reference. Here it says, God is your throne, if it's a nominative, just like Jesus says in Revelation 3, my Father on his throne. That fits better with God is your throne, right? Because God is the one who is the source of the one who is said to be the one whom God is the throne, right? The source of whatever it is this person has is God. God is the one who is going to keep you enthroned forever and ever. Same as Psalm 44, 45. It means the same thing, only in the greater sense in which the Son inherits a better name. Okay, so that never changes. None of these things change from here that point where after he made a purification, and then all these things either took place or will take place in terms of him coming into the earth and the fulfillment of that text, like we talked about in our prior videos. And then the distinction between the angels, including, perhaps even according to Trinitarians, right? The Son as the angel of Yahweh, serving as public servants in the past, but with the Son now, since his resurrection, right hand of God, being enthroned by God, as God being his throne forever, sitting on his Father's throne. And he is the one who enthroned the Son, who is the God of the Son, and anointed him more than his partners. Right? So, let me go back to another section here. And then I'll bring that section back up. So I believe it's quite clear when we look at the complete evidence presented in these texts and the context leading up to it, that what is being said of the Son, specifically in verse 8, in comparison with the angels who served as servants in a non-temple sense in the past, the way that the Son is a public servant in Hebrews 8:12 as a high priest, right? He's a spirit as well, made a life-giving spirit, 1 Corinthians 15:45. The angels are spirits, but their service is different. The angels are not the high priest. The angels are not enthroned by God. God is not their throne. Or, if it's evocative, the angels are not the ones who are called God, a la Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, and the original application in Psalm 44:45, the way the Son is in heaven. They're not. They didn't go through what he did. And the author of Hebrews goes on to talk about it. So, let me just point out a couple things and then we'll wind things up and conclude the show. I talked about earlier, specifically in the pre-show, but a little bit maybe at the start, about some of the early church fathers and how there's not a whole lot of information in the volumes I reviewed for the Apostolic Fathers, the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and I reviewed Athanasius and Gregory of Nyssa. It's not about the full range of church writings on these texts, but I wanted to look into it a little bit, and there's not really much at all in terms of discussion of Hebrews 1, 7 through 9, and Hebrews 1:8 is really not discussed at all, even when it's quoted. For example, in Athanasius, 4 Discourses Against the Arians. I'm going to read from page 340 real briefly of volume 4, Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, Hendrickson second series. In the index, it only lists Hebrews 1:7, but the source, I went ahead and looked it up. I'm glad I did, because it also includes at least the first part of verse 8, the "Thy throne, O God," or "God is your throne" part. But Athanasius doesn't really get into that part. He just quotes it as part of his discussion, sort of connected to where we left off last time, but which I'll pick up again when we get to Hebrews 1, 10 through 12. We're going to talk a lot more about Athanasius' view of that, because that's really what he gets into more. He just references Hebrews 1, 7, and part of 8 in this part, excuse me, of his discussion. So I wanted to point that out, especially since it's not shown in the index. You might be looking for specific examples of Hebrews 1:8. If you're using that volume, it won't be shown in the copy I have. It only shows 1:7, but part of 1:8 is there. Same with the volume from the same publisher and series of Gregory of Nyssa. It had Hebrews 1:7, but it didn't show Hebrews 1:8, I believe, in the index for Gregory of Nyssa against Eunomius. I'm going to be reading briefly from page 234. And he's talking about Eunomius. He says, "But this man degrades the Lord of angels as to the rank of an angel, as though he had not heard that the angels are ministering spirits and a flame of fire." So he makes a distinction in terms of nature between the angels as ministering spirits, flame of fire, and the Lord of angels in terms of, he distinguishes between the difference in rank versus nature. But the text he uses is Hebrews 1:7. It refers to the angels as spirits, flames of fire, which is exactly what the Son is. And that's how he's described before and after he's resurrected. Now, it does talk about them being public servants. And so there is a sense in which, you might argue that he's saying that they're different in terms of nature there. But the Son is also called the public servant in Hebrews, just for a different reason. He's using it to make a point in terms of a distinction between the Son and the angels in terms of nature. And that's exactly what Hebrews 1 does not do. It does not even do it in verses 10 through 12. And I say even because of the way it's often used by Athanasius and others. But I'm going to get to it. I've talked about it before. Staying with where we are, we know to this point it's very clear. The Son is better than the angels. Explicitly. Because of what it says here. He inherited a name better than them. The same one who goes on to describe the fact that the angels are spirits which include the Son in public service before he was raised to the right hand of God, right? Again, context is key. Because otherwise Trinitarians have to deny that verse 7 and the angels that it describes includes the angel of Jehovah. If this reference in Hebrews 1:7 to the angels as spirits, public servants, flames of fire, makes them by nature different than the Son, that's not only inconsistent with the argument that the author of Hebrews is making, which is that he's better in terms of the name, just like Philippians 2 does. That's position, not nature. But you'd have to then state that none of the angels who were public servants as flames of fire, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Judges, the original quotation, Psalm 104:4, are of the same nature as the Son. And I believe that's going to put him into conflict with the angel of Jehovah, right? Whom many times they identify as Jehovah, essentially, as the uncreated angel. We'll get to that more later. But my point is, if that's what they want to argue, I don't see how they can then eliminate the very references in the texts to those angels as flames of fire, which include the angel of Jehovah, who speaks as Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all that we read. So I don't find that the way Trinitarians translate or interpret these texts has the best explanation based on the evidence, right? The use of the nominative in the context of the Septuagint of Psalm 44. The fact that if we have to use it as a vocative in Hebrews 1:8, we then have to deal with the earliest texts, earliest and best texts, P46, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, using autou versus su, which definitely makes a difference if you're going to take the first part of verse 8 as a vocative, thy throne, O God, and then the second part is the third person reference, the scepter of his kingdom, which isn't even what the text you're quoting says. So it's a deliberate change, verse 8. But even if it isn't, even if it's calling the Son God, it's no different than the way that angels are called God in their public service as flames of fire, Judges 13, other text, Psalm 3, Exodus 3. But it's different because the Son is at the right hand of God in the lofty places. They were not. They had not come down and made a purification for our sins. They were not given a name better than them, exalted to the right hand of God, to the glory of the Father. That's the difference. That's why he keeps quoting all these messianic texts and then making application to the Son, the same way that the texts were applied to other ones, but not to the same extent, because they did not do what he did, nor did they give their life as the last Adam, so that they could be resurrected to the right hand of God. His God. All of these things fit and make sense when you don't try to fit the Trinity into them. If you just look at the context leading up from the fact that he's at the right hand of God, that he's actually performing a public service according to later chapters in Hebrews that we read earlier, but not in the same way that he as the angel of Yahweh or other angels in the past did before these things took place. But because these things took place, God is his throne forever and ever, just like the Davidic promise was stated, that it would never end, right? The princely rule, Isaiah 9:6, would come to be upon his shoulders, and that kingdom would never end. God is your throne forever and ever, just like the Psalm said. You loved righteousness, you hated lawlessness. That's why God, your God, God of you, Greek and Hebrew, anointed you with exaltation more than your partners. And I believe partners here, in terms of the context, seems to be referring to the angels, that he's making a distinction between, in terms of the Son being the one that these texts apply to versus them. It could be that it's talking about, like in the Psalm, potentially the other kings, and how the king in the Psalm 44, 45, and here with the Son are exalted more than them. But in the context leading up to this, it clearly is talking about the angels, is it not? And how he is what? Better than them. Well, that's exactly what it says here in Hebrews 1:9. And it's what we're going to talk about more next in part 7 as we continue our discussion in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10, 11, and 12.